Good morning.
Good morning.
I'm glad you're here. If you were walking down the street, and I was walking on the other side of the street, and you were crossing, and I yelled at you and I said, "Hey, there's a big truck, move, get out of the way." You would maybe think to yourself, to be a thought process that said, "Hey, that's Rob, and he built a history of being fairly trustworthy in matters, and his vision when he's wearing his glasses seems to be pretty good, so I'll give some credibility to what he just said and say that there's a high likelihood that there is a truck coming at me and I'll get out of the way." You'd make all those decisions in an instant, hopefully, but that would have been built on faith in me, again, in my judgment, my opinion of if that truck is going to hit you or not. And that faith would have been translated into action of you believing what I said and then jumping out of the way of the truck. Now, we would do all those things without all that the mechanics of it. It would be something that would be natural. But that's really an expression of faith, that we're willing to put something into action because of faith on our part in someone or something. We've been talking about faith. The last couple of sermons last week I started looking in Hebrews 11 about some things about faith, some examples of faith and what that means. And we were looking at the seen versus the unseen, and that we have faith in the unseen because of what has been seen. That credibility that God has built up, His trustworthiness, that helps us to have faith in Him in those times when we're not quite as certain. In Hebrews chapter 11, if you were to go through and do a word study in connection to the word faith, you would see that there is a phrase that is repeated 38 times just in chapter 11 of Hebrews. And it says, "by faith," and then it lists the name of someone. And after that person is listed, there is an action verb. You would see that all of those verbs that follow are action verbs. It will say, "by faith, so-and-so did something." And that's the pattern. That's the example that we have in the 11th chapter of Hebrews, in that great roll call of the faithful. But it's important to understand that each of these people that are listed as an example, as someone to aspire to, they did something, or they endured something on behalf of that faith. And I said at the beginning of this series that faith is a big idea. It's a big term. It encompasses a lot of things. So anything that we can see in Scripture that helps us sort of narrow that down and clarify what faith really is and what faith really does. Faith makes your feet move. Again, faith in someone calling out to you would help your feet to move to get out of the way of that truck. But faith must require, or it must culminate in action ultimately. 2 Corinthians chapter 5 and verse 7, Paul says that we walk by faith, not by sight. Now, we talked about the sight part of that last week. But notice what Paul said there. He said we walk by faith and not by sight. We don't stand with faith or sit with faith, but we walk by it. So each of these examples, and we'll look at a few of those this morning, we'll see that they did something. And what these examples did is what the writer of the Hebrew epistle was trying to get across to the readers that he originally wrote to. But these people that we'll look at this morning did what the recipients of the Hebrew letter were supposed to do. And by relation of us reading this letter as well, they did what we are supposed to do. So we'll be challenged by this, and we'll see through their example how we ought to live our faith as well. And what the purpose of the writer of the Hebrew letter was, there were some Christians that had come from a Jewish background, and they were Christians for a while, but they were starting to go back to some of those elements of the Old Testament. Again, we talked about the seen versus the unseen, and they liked the idea of a temple that they could look at and even reach out and touch. as opposed to this spiritual, heavenly temple or tabernacle. And they were struggling with some of those concepts, so they were trying to go back to that. But what we see by the example of these that we'll look at this morning is that we have to trust God in the unseen things of the New Testament and not return to those things that were under the Old Testament, because the Jews had what the writer here refers to as the shadows of those things under the Old Testament, under the Old Covenant, the Law of Moses. They had the shadow, the temple, the tabernacle, the sacrifices, the priesthood. All of those things were shadows of the greater that was to come. And we talked about that in last week, about the substance in Hebrews 11:1. The substance is the New Testament, the New Covenant, and we have that as Christians. So they had the shadow, we have the substance. So, by that relation, we should do even more with our faith than they did. So we'll be challenged by their example, not just to do the same, but to do even more, to have even greater expressions of our faith than they did. But faith isn't something that we believe. Instead, it is what we do. It is how we live our life. That's what faith really is. Not purely a mental exercise. So what we'll see this morning is these examples in Hebrews 11 show us that our faith must take action, our faith must be obedient, and our faith must endure trials. Beginning in Hebrews chapter 11 and verse 4, we see the example of Abel, that son of Adam and Eve, the very first people on the earth. And Hebrews 11:4 says that Abel, being dead, still speaks. And he speaks through those scriptures, just as all of these examples do. So if they're speaking through the scriptures, then we need to listen up. So we'll see, first of all, this morning, some examples of active faith. And we begin with Abel. Verse 4 of Hebrews 11, by faith Abel offered to God a more excellent sacrifice than Cain. That was his brother. They both offered sacrifices. Why did they do this? It seems that there may have been a command. We don't have the command recorded for us in Genesis, but it seems strange that they would have just come up with this idea of offering some sacrifice to God. So likely there was a command of some form that God had given about sacrifice, and there were some parameters, because we see that Abel's met those parameters and Cain's did not. But we see that Abel had faith here. Abel had faith, and he offered a sacrifice because he wanted to please God. So he wanted to do something about it. He wanted to show that. He wanted to express that faith in that offering of a sacrifice. And we see that his example, his sacrifice was accepted by God, and Cain's was not. Again, we don't know exactly why. That's for another discussion for another time. But we see that Abel's sacrifice was accepted because he trusted in God's will on this matter of what to offer for sacrifices rather than his own. It seems that Cain was just following his own opinion, what he thought would be a good sacrifice, the harvest of the land. But we see that Abel offered a blood sacrifice to God from the flock. For whatever reason at that time, that was what was accepted. So we can learn from his example that we need to trust in God's will, what he has commanded on things, what he has told us he wants us to do, rather than our own judgment, our own opinions. So by faith Abel offered a sacrifice. In verse 7, we see that by faith Noah prepared an ark. We talked about this last week. But this was an act of faith on the part of Noah. He didn't just believe God, but he trusted God that he was going to spare him and his family from the flood, like he said he would. So as an expression of that faith, of that belief in God and trusting him, Noah spent years, decades even, building the ark to protect him and his family from rain that he had likely never seen before. But his faith became active, and he did something with it. In verse 29, we learn there that by faith, the nation of Israel, the people of Israel, the freed slaves from Egypt, passed through the Red Sea. They passed through the Red Sea by faith. That would have required some faith but it also required action on their part, because you see, as much as they trusted God, as much as they believed God, even after witnessing the 10 plagues upon Egypt, their faith would have been strong. Seeing the power of God and His faithfulness to the promise that He was going to get them through safely and bring them into the promised land, but they couldn't just trust God and stand on the bank. They had to walk on that faith. They had to walk through the bed of the Red Sea. That would have been a scary thing, don't you think? Walls of water on both sides. And it was a long journey. At the narrowest point, it's a good mile or two across the Red Sea. That would have been a long, slow walk with all those wagons, children, herds, and flocks. That would have required some faith. But their faith caused them to walk across and trust God that He was going to deliver them. Now see, Pharaoh's army tried the same thing. Pharaoh's army tried to cross the Red Sea, but they had no faith. They didn't have faith in God. They only had anger and revenge in their hearts. Because they had no faith, they died. The waters came and encompassed them. But Israel passed through the Red Sea by faith. By faith, verse 33 tells us that the mouths of lions were stopped. This is pretty likely a reference to Daniel. What we read about in Daniel chapter 6, where he was thrown into the lion's den. But we ask the question, why was he put into the lion's den? What did he do to get there? Because by faith, Daniel prayed. And he did so daily against the order of the king. His faith was put into action. Praying, violating the king's order because he had a higher calling. See, it was more important to Daniel to obey God than it was to obey the king of the Medes who was there, ruling at the time. It was more important for Daniel to obey God, just like Peter and John. Just like they said in Acts chapter 5 and verse 29, when the Sanhedrin ordered them to stop preaching in the name of Jesus. And John and Peter, both, they said, we can't do that. We must obey God rather than men. We've been commanded to preach. We believe, we have faith in this God. And He's commanded us to preach. Therefore, we're going to put that into action and continue to preach, even if it violates their rules. Their faith was obedient. That's the next example we're going to look at. We've seen active faith, and now there's obedient faith. In verse 17, by faith, Abraham offered his son Isaac. This would have been a very traumatic experience to go through. Some have read this and said, how could God ask him to do this? Well, we always have to remember, Isaac didn't die. It all worked out just fine. As unfair as that request may have seemed to us. But Abraham was willing to do this. He had faith in God. He trusted God. And he offered his son Isaac. He didn't kill him, but he offered him. He was willing. And that was because he trusted that God could raise him up from the dead. He believed that if God required him to kill his son, that God would raise Isaac up from the dead. Why? Because Abraham had faith in the promises of God. See, God had promised blessings through his son Isaac. He said, through your seed, all the nations of the world will be blessed. You'll be a great nation. More than the stars in the sky and the grains of sand in the sea. God had made these promises that they would come through Isaac. So Abraham, in his logic, said, well, Isaac must live then. He's not going to die. Whatever happens, if he dies, God will raise him up again. That gave him the faith to put that into action and offer his son Isaac. And God stopped the hand of Abraham with the knife in it before he killed Isaac. And God said in Genesis chapter 22 and verse 12, God said to Abraham, now I know that you fear God, since you have not withheld your only son from me. It wasn't that God didn't know this before, that he needed to learn something. But he's telling Abraham, now I know that you fear me. God didn't really know this until Abraham offered his son Isaac, until he acted on that faith. Because it wasn't until then that Abraham's faith was proven in his action. And it was then that he proved himself to be obedient to God. Moses, another example given us in verse 28. By faith, Moses kept the Passover. This is referring to the last of the 10 plagues, the death of the firstborn in Egypt. And God commanded Israel through Moses, take the blood of a lamb and smear it across the doorposts of each house, so that the angel of death, the destroyer, would pass over and not kill anyone in the house, the firstborn. So they put the blood on the doorpost. Now, it wouldn't have done any good if Moses and if all of Egypt would have believed in God that he was going to do this. But if they didn't put the blood on the doorpost, they all would have died. The firstborn would have been killed in those households as well. So faith is a good thing, but it must be expressed in action. And it must be expressed in obedience. Rahab is an example given us in verse 31 of Hebrews 11. By faith, Rahab welcomed the spies. That is, the spies that were sent into the city of Jericho where she lived. They were sent in there to check out the defenses and see how the city was set up, preparing for the conquest of that city and then opening the door to the rest of the land of Canaan. And Rahab knew about the God that went with Israel, with these spies. She believed that God had the power to destroy Jericho. She had faith. And that faith led her to welcome the spies, to take them into her household, to hide them, to protect them. And that faith in the God that was going to destroy that city and deliver it into the hands of the Israelites, faith in that God caused her also to tie a red cord in her window. The spies said, look, tie a red cord in the window of your house, and then when we come and take the city, we will not kill all of you and your family. You will be spared. She could have believed their promise. She could have believed that they would do that. But if she had not actually tied that red cord in the window, if her faith wouldn't have led to action, it wouldn't have saved her. The example of Rahab there, one that was obedient, doing what was told. You might notice, as you read through Hebrews 11 and think of the history of Israel, that the Hebrew writer skipped over those 40 unfaithful years in the wilderness. There's nothing said about the wilderness wandering time. So it's just sort of omitted. Why? Well, because there was nothing to write home about there. There were no examples of faith and obedience from the wandering. Israel really didn't do anything except complain and test God and wait for all of the adults to die so their children could go and take the promised land. In verse 34, we also see there something that faith did. That these by faith quenched the violence of fire. There's a list of sort of some random things happening, going on, that were done by God's people of faith. And it was said by faith, they quenched the violence of fire. This probably is likely a reference to what we read about in Daniel chapter 3. The 3 young men who were friends of Daniel, there was a command given to worship a golden statue of King Nebuchadnezzar, and they refused to worship this golden statue. And the king said, you better do it, or I'll throw you in the fiery furnace. And they said, our God is able to deliver us, and we will not bow down to this image, even if you kill us. God can save us, and he may save us, but even if he doesn't, we will not be obedient to this command to worship this false god. Rather, they were obedient to God. They obeyed God to the death, and they were saved from the fire. See, faith is not just a one-time event, but it is a lifelong process that requires endurance. Close this morning by looking at some examples of enduring faith. Sometimes this takes a while. It's not just a certain event, but it's something that is a long process. Think about the life of Sarah, whose womb had been closed. She wanted to have children. Her and Abraham wanted to have children, but she was unable to. And yet, Hebrews 11 and verse 11 says that by faith, Sarah herself also received strength to conceive seed, and she bore a child when she was past the age. Here's the important part. Because she had judged him faithful who had promised. By faith, Sarah considered God that he would be faithful to his promise. God had said back in Genesis chapter 18 and verse 14 that Sarah was going to become pregnant within the next year when he came and visited her and Abraham. And she had faith that God would allow their old physical bodies to produce a child. We know they had faith because the Bible tells us they did. Now we need to remember, they believed God was going to fulfill this promise. But we know that Isaac was not miraculously conceived. Jesus was the only one that happened for. Isaac was not miraculously conceived, so even though Abraham and Sarah believed that God was going to fulfill this promise, they still continued to do their part until God chose to bless them with their child. Sarah considered God faithful, that he would keep that promise, so they kept on acting and living their lives in belief that that promise was going to come true, and it happened. Now in verse 24 of Hebrews 11, we see that Moses, by faith, suffered affliction with the Israelites. He cast his lot with the Hebrew slaves. He realized his heritage, and he said that he was going to accept the same fate and suffering that they did. He entered into their suffering with them. In doing so, going from second in command only to Pharaoh, down to that of a lowly slave, he endured shame, he endured persecution, and it wasn't just a fleeting moment, it was a long period. Even to the point that he fled into the wilderness from Egypt, and he was there living as a shepherd, forgotten for 40 years. Why? By faith. By faith he lived that way. Chose to suffer the fate of the Hebrew slaves rather than live in the palace of Pharaoh. That was an enduring faith. Other scattered example we have here says that in verses 35 and 36 of Hebrews 11 that others were tortured, they were scourged, they were mocked and imprisoned. We can think of lots of examples of who this is exactly talking about. We know that Joseph certainly was one that was imprisoned, and he was imprisoned for refusing to commit adultery. He told Potiphar's wife, I cannot sin against my God in this way. So he chose to be obedient to God, to place his faith in God, that he was going to take care of him. And he did, rather than give in to sin. And he was imprisoned for that. We read about a prophet named Micaiah who was imprisoned by the wicked king Ahab. And the reason why he was imprisoned was because he would always prophesy bad news. And Ahab just got tired of hearing it. And yet Micaiah continued to proclaim the truth whenever he was asked, living by faith. Jeremiah was imprisoned several times over his ministry of about 40 years for what we would call today negative preaching. And yet he endured, remaining faithful to the calling that God had brought him to. John the Baptizer was imprisoned for speaking against Herod's adultery and his unlawful marriage. And he endured to the point that he was killed. Some were put to death. Verse 37 of Hebrews 11 says some were stoned. You know, some of the Old Testament prophets were stoned to death. Jesus rebukes those in Jerusalem, saying that they killed the prophets that were sent to her. We read about a New Testament prophet in Acts chapter 7, a man named Stephen, who was stoned to death for preaching the truth. But he did so by faith. Others were sawn in two. Now this is something that Jewish traditions tells us that Isaiah, the prophet Isaiah, died in this way, that he was sawn in two. Kind of a horrific fate there. But all of these did this by faith. It wasn't just something they believed, it was something that they lived, that they put into action. Their faith was more important to them than their physical lives. You see, faith has to cost you something. So like these examples, our faith has to be active and obedient and enduring. Those who would say you only have to believe to have faith and be saved. I wonder if those people have not ever read Hebrews 11 with an open mind and an open heart. Jesus asked the crowd gathered before him one day, why do you call me Lord, but you don't do what I say? And he told a parable about two sons, whom their father had told them to go and work in the vineyard. And one son said he would go, but he never did go. The other said he would not. But then later he repented and he went and worked in the vineyard. Jesus said that the one who went was the one that was pleasing to his father. The empty words of the first son meant nothing without action. They say the proof of the pudding is in the eating. Well, The proof of faith is in the doing. If you truly believe, then you will do. You will act on that faith. The question is, do you believe that Jesus Christ is the Son of God and that He died for your sins? If you believe that, then put that belief into action by repenting of your sins and being baptized so that your sins can be washed away. Or if you have obeyed, but you let your faith grow inactive, then recommit yourself today to doing the work of the kingdom. And if we can pray for you today, if we can encourage you to make your faith active, to make it part of your life, to make it something that determines your action and behavior. If we can help you do any of those things, if we can pray for you, then please make that need known to us as we stand and sing this song. Please come.